Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the True Psychiatry. After about a year of stalkish behavior, I finally coerced Dr. Lisa Cosgrove to an interview, and she did not come alone. So Dr. Lisa Cosgrove, she's a PhD in clinical psychology. She's a professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, my neighbor, and she has been relentlessly publishing about the undue influence of commercial interests in the field of psychiatry. And she has a collaborator, Dr. Milutin Kostic. He's a practicing psychiatrist in the Institute of Mental Health in Belgrade and associate professor at University of Belgrade, and now in a full scholarship researching with Dr. Cosgrove. Lisa, Milutin, thank you for accepting my invitation.
Thank you.
I'm going to start already with pretty much the fillet of our conversation, and ask you guys to tell me about the proportions of doctors that work for PHARMA that are also involved in DSM task forces, and we go from there.
Sure. So I can start and Milutin can jump in. So back in 2006, Shelley Krimsky and I did our first DSM study where we looked at the financial associations between the DSM panel and task force members and the pharmaceutical industry. And we found that approximately 58% of all of those folks had ties. And at that time, we also found that the ties were particularly strong. That is, 100% of the panels had ties. Members of the panels had ties to the pharmaceutical industry, for the disorders for which pharmacological treatment was a first-line treatment. So, for example, schizophrenia and psychotic disorders, mood disorders. All of those folks had ties. I'd like to think, perhaps a little outrageously, that maybe the publication of our study had a little bit to do with the APA developing a disclosure policy for the first time in its history. And so we replicated our study the year before the DSM-5 came out in 2012, and unfortunately found that despite increased transparency, that is, despite a disclosure policy, the same percentage of folks had ties. And although some of the panels went down in terms of the percentage of ties, other panels went up. So the bottom line is nothing changed despite a disclosure policy.
And that was 2006 when APA came up with disclosure policy. That was the first study you had.
2000, when we published in 2006, they did not have a policy. Then they instituted a policy in 2007. So we replicated our study and found that despite increased transparency, it didn't result in any fewer ties. And then just this January, we replicated our study for the DSM-5 TR, which came out in 2022. And what's, I think, interesting about that study is our previous studies were done before the Open Payments Database, which is a open source database where anyone, you don't have to have a university library subscription, anyone can enter a name in of a practicing physician in the U.S. and see what, if any, monies they've received from the pharmaceutical industry. And so we were able to look at not only the percentage of ties, but the amount of money that came in, as well as the type of ties. And so just real briefly, what we found, and we were very conservative. We only looked from 2016 to 2019, because that's congruent with the APA's previous disclosure policy. So just in that short span, the panel members received a total of over $14 million. And again, the panels with the most ties were those for whom pharmacological treatment is the standard treatment. For example, medication-induced movement disorders, that panel received, I think it was about $8 million. So once again, we saw the same thing occurring. And then the other thing, that I just like to point out that was disturbing to me is the fact that about a third of those folks with ties were what industry refers to as KOLs, key opinion leaders, and industry, as you and your listeners probably know, industry taps people at major universities who have usually published prolifically and are well known within the medical community to be speakers. And what a key opinion leader does is basically marketing for the pharmaceutical industry, because they're not allowed to deviate from the slides and information that the pharmaceutical industry gives them. And the pharmaceutical industry knows that this is a great way to influence prescription practices, for example, because you get a big mucky-muck talking to, a room of 200 physicians, and you can really have a significant impact on prescription practices. So the fact that approximately a third of those that had ties also were KOLs is really problematic. Medical schools in the U.S., most of them do not allow their medical faculty to be on speakers bureaus, to be KOLs, because they know that it could have a really disrupting influence on the pedagogy of, the teaching practices of for their students.
Yeah, we do see in my personal life, I see colleagues, I would say, that you can tell the kickback laws, they were just bypassed with this idea of consultants and speakers for pharma. And you can, working closely with other professionals, you can identify by their practices, you can identify what companies they have a tie with, and then you go to open payment and bingo, it's like flawless, always there. One thing that I like to ask both of you is, what motivated both of you to take this much needed and solitary, unpopular road?
Milutin, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I would just take a step back because the KOL story, when I was just finished my residency and became a psychiatrist, there was this happening where around 20 young psychiatrists were called up to hold a presentation on anything. And we were given some relatively small amount, but not for Serbian terms, not extremely small amount of money. And there was like a prize for the winner whose presentation is the best. And we had the full freedom to speak whatever we want to about. Now, I was very young then, and I didn't know what this was about. And I held my presentation. I got some money. This was the last pharma money I got like 8-9 years ago. And I didn't know about the concept of KOL at the time. I didn't know, and I didn't think about these things, the morality of this, etc. It was something that was completely foreign to me. But the interesting thing is that they weren't listening, because Lisa said, well published, etc. Authors, and for instance, I suppose for smaller countries and places, this isn't the main prerequisite, but I'm sure that everywhere the main prerequisite for being a KOL is actually not how good you do studies or something like that, but how entertaining you are, how engaging. So this is completely a market. So we were talking about anything. I was presenting my PhD work. Someone else was talking completely from their head. So, and it was just a competition to see who's gonna be most engaging, so he can get actually there. So thankfully, I didn't win, although that was unfair. But this is I was lucky. And then to your question, well, amongst others, if not most, Lisa was the one whose work I've been reading and getting into this type of topic and understanding it more. And this is why when I was talking with my family and thinking about through the Fulbright scholarship coming to the United States, this was one of the only places I wanted to go, and the first one I had in mind, and thankfully I got it. So yeah, but it is lonely. A lot of people don't understand it. I have friends colleagues who are great people, who are not evil people, who don't do for pharma, but they don't see anything wrong with it. They don't understand. They say, yeah, but it doesn't influence me. And when I tell them there are studies that show that even one lunch can influence how much you prescribe a drug, that it's not, it doesn't have to be some huge money and then you're bought. We're humans, you just get a little, and yeah, they gave me lunch, let's prescribe this instead of that drug. It just goes on a subconscious level. So it's very influential.
How about you, Lisa? How did you get into this kind of research? How come you sense something was wrong with it?
Well, I wish I had a erudite and articulate answer, but the truth of the matter is, like much of my research, I discovered something by accident and became interested in it. And I'm oh, okay.
We're listening to you. Still going.
Sorry about that. So I was saying that I wish I had a very articulate answer and linear answer, but the truth is, like most of my research now, I came across something by accident and became interested. And I was actually doing menstrual cycle research at the time when Prozac's patent was about to expire. And in the U.S., as I'm sure you're aware, Eli Lilly tried to hedge their bets and put in a new drug application in for Serafem. And I just noticed by accident that there was a connection with the folks on the DSM panel and people providing testimony to the FDA saying that Serafem is efficacious and premenstrual dysphoric disorder is a real disorder distinct from depression. And so I became interested in this, but I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I didn't have any training in how you study conflicts of interest. And so I just was reading up on it and kept coming across the name of Dr. Sheldon Krimsky. And I just called him up, and that was back in the day when people actually answered their office phones. And here I was, an untenured professor from a state school, but like a good scientist, he was interested and mentored me. And that's how we developed the study and collaborated on many other studies. So the short answer is it was completely by accident. But
I'm very thankful. I'm very thankful for a happy accident. It does make a lot of difference. Now, it was one of the questions I suggested on the email, and let's just jump there. Why is it so hard to convince our colleagues about the implications of these things? Like, I started this podcast roughly a year and a half, 2 years ago, and one of the people I interviewed was Robert Whittaker. And one of his stands is that if you have taken, if you have been in bed with pharma, maybe you should have to explain this thing legally. And on account of interviewing that guy, I lost a couple friends in the field. They said, well, you know what this guy thinks? And I said, well, and I'm a guy, I have $19. I got a stake on account of a team building activity in the hospital I was working, and I wasn't aware it was financed by pharma, but had I been, I wouldn't have seen the problem in those days because I was absolutely blind to this thing. It takes a while until you realize. But we do know there's research in the field of how this influence happens, and how, despite our thoughts that I'm just going to eat for free, because I hear that a lot when I used to have a mentoring institute. I'm now fusing it with my private practice, and I would mentor a lot of psych NPs, and I'm always running ideas with colleagues and things like that. And I've heard that a lot. I've heard a lot of people say, I'm just eating for free. That's what it is. It doesn't influence me. But we have papers in that regard, don't we?
Yes, absolutely. One of my favorite books is titled "Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me." And the story that Milutin told about his colleagues, and I'm sure you have similar ones, is very true. People, people think that they're immune to bias, even though social psychologists have done really interesting research. And when they've asked people who've received industry funding, they'll by and large say, no, it hasn't affected the design, my, analysis, distribution of results, etc. But Joe down the hall, I'm not so sure. He gets a lot of money, and I wonder. So people are able to recognize that in others, that it might affect them. But it's part of the human condition to have implicit bias and to remain blissfully ignorant of those biases.
Fair. And then, are there task forces of DSM that are more connected to pharma than others?
Yes, I would say again that it seems to me from our research that it's the panel members who are working on conditions for which pharmacological treatment is seen as the standard treatment.
We did have in the past 10 years this expansion of the diagnosis of bipolar and ADHD, right? We went from bipolar being understood as maybe a 2% prevalence syndrome to now I think we are close to 1 in 10 Americans carrying the diagnosis. And ADHD, we had maybe 3 to 4% of kids, and now everybody has ADHD. To the point that America is producing and selling per capita 144 tons of like equivalents of Adderall per year. And that is like 10 times more than France, UK, and Germany together per capita. It's not a matter of the size of the country, right? Like everybody, like America runs on Adderall, right? It's I can get in trouble for that. But do we see a connection between those task forces? Do we have a proportion of those task forces, those panels, that reflect this interest with DSM and making? Because we can quote some authors. We have had Joseph Biderman that passed away last year, and his relentless decade of work to expand the diagnosis of bipolarity to children and the use of antipsychotics to children as well. I think we also have Jules Engst in Switzerland, who also has been working relentlessly to expand the diagnosis of bipolarity. Do we have a proportion of doctors working for pharma in those specific task forces?
Yes, but there's a caveat that I would like to emphasize, and then of course I want to hear what Milutin has to say, and that is that, as one of my colleagues said, these industry relationships create pro-industry habits of thought. They create a impulse to medicalize distress. It's very different than a quid pro quo corruption. And so I want to be really clear about that. I think the people with these ties are good people who believe that they're doing a public service and that they're being paid for their expertise. So the other caveat that I just wanted to make is, and this might sound a little strange given my research, but I think conflicts of interest might not be the best term or the best focus. I think, I had the good fortune of working in Larry Lessig's lab a few years ago, and it was the lab on institutional corruption. And it had a really profound effect on my thinking. It helped me shift to a more systemic perspective. So I see pharma as one economy of influence that reinforces the overdiagnosis and overtreatment, but it's not, in my view, the only or maybe even the predominant one. I think social media, for example, has played a critical role in particularly young folks embracing an ADHD diagnosis. And Milutin's writing a brilliant book about this, and he can speak more to that. So I just want to be clear that I feel like conflicts of interest are important, but it's just one economy of influence that we need to address.
Yeah, and it's just the last stage. This is the nail in the coffin, basically, when But even in some aspects, people who work in these fields are human. They're not, AI machines who will get the best results, and they dabble in politics. Lisa and me talked today, I think, or yesterday, about the politics of some of the DSM panelists and how they were trying to navigate the interest of different groups. So when you get to the point that the public ask for you do this, and then the psychiatry is sometimes even at the dead end, and it has to do it. And we had that with the diagnosis with the homosexuality, which are, for instance, good examples, but there are some bad examples as well. And for instance, ADHD is, like Lisa said, something that came from this neurodiversity movement, as I think originally a very, very good, noble idea, but it morphed through social media. But this is, again, it's not like pharma just comes at the end. They also pay patient groups that then say we as patients need more of this drug or more of this diagnosis. We're underdiagnosed, and then you get a sense that it's like publicly something that's organically coming, when actually when you look at the who's funding these organizations, you find out that actually it's again pharma just pretending it's something else. So this is the DSM test panel is just the end result, which in the end, a lot of times, if the political pressure is strong enough, I could even say it doesn't have too much power, or not as much power as we would like to think.
Please convince me of that. I'll explain why I say that. For example, now we have, I understand the claim, and I absolutely agree that people are not waking up in the morning thinking, right, let's do something Machiavellical here. But when I see, for example, the papers on adult onset ADHS, right, adult, attention deficit and hyperactivity syndrome, those papers claiming that there is adult onset of inattention to a syndromic level that deserve that diagnosis. I just can't get over the fact that from a common sense perspective, it's very hard to find an adult with kids in a full-time job and, they can actually focus on anything for that matter. And I have had in clinical practice multiple patients coming to me saying either my therapist gave me the diagnosis, of my neighbor did, or my previous psychiatrist, which nowadays we know we're all checking boxes. It could have been a computer program that gave the diagnosis. And I think the way that most of us practice psychiatry nowadays could easily be replaced by a binary program from the 80s, like a chess playing thing. But they come with that, and I granted I was a psychologist before I went to medical school, and functional analysis, psychoanalysis, all these things I can traffic, and it was like 20 years of my life. While psychiatry, I became one in 2016. So we go through this initial assessment, and this happened. I cannot tell you how many times where I can say when was the breaking point of that person, where the tasks just became too much for their ability to perform, and they start facing a decline. And simple tasks like, okay, ask your spouse to help, or, change something in this routine, like simple tasks, just take something off your plate. And patients cry when I say, you don't, there's no history compatible with attention deficit in your childhood. I just don't see these traits, that we could justify putting you in a fairly harmful medication regimen. And then people come back, and I'm going to say 8 out of 10 times when they come back, because, they know what they're looking for. And another thing I tell my patients is, I'll be honest with you, I don't want to be part of it, but if you go to the next doctor, probably you're going to get what you're looking for, right? But, for the most part, my mind, shared decision-making, if I'm not comfortable and you're not comfortable, there's no drug. And but people come back when they come back, and they come back saying, wow, right, I did it. And really that was what it was. So with a simple approach, for me, it's hard to imagine that there is no directive to an extent to say I'm going to finance. I know I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's hard for me not to see some degree of intentionality behind this thing. We had the other day I was on LinkedIn, and it was right after this new postpartum depression antidepressant was FDA approved, I believe, or something about it. I don't know. And there is this doctor that I think is the second on our list of open payments, frequently uses a bow tie, and he shows up with a on the same week with a post saying about this mother who killed her kids in this doctor in New York. And we had no informations, and he had no informations. And he said, I don't know if this was related to postpartum depression, but postpartum depression is a problem we have to start addressing. So now that we have a medication, for me, it's very hard not to see the intentionality behind it, to see that he woke up in the morning and said, I'm going to do a great service to humanity today because now we can. I just, for me, it's a huge struggle. That's why I said, please convince me that these forces are sort of in the background of our minds 100% of the time.
I would say that I think there's a link there, but I would say it's multi-determined. So to use your ADHD example, too often in the mental health field, as you're aware of, we use medication response to infer causality about a disorder. So you get pharma, reps and marketing to suggest that you give stimulants to adults. And as we know, most people who take stimulants, it helps them focus more. So then you see the potential growth then of ADHD as a diagnosis. And you could see individual psychiatrists going, wow, I saw my patient do a lot better, and they're talking about doing a lot better now that they're taking, Vyvanse or whatever they might be taking. So I do think there's a link. I just think I envision it as more of a web than a simple linear causal link.
But we don't see that with diagnoses that are not easily expandable. For example, and I have made this statement before to Paul Andrews, which is a personal friend and a guy that I find like of a geniality. He's an evolutionary psychologist in Canada. But I said, we only saw an expansion of sexy diagnosis. He questioned the word sexy because he's an evolutionary guy, right? So he's going to say sexy means you're going to get laid more, right? And in the sense of, selection and stuff like that, which may be true even to that extent nowadays, considering the posts you see on social media, as you guys mentioned, about having ADHD and things like that. But we had in the past 10 years, maybe most of our meds, the patented meds, were antipsychotics and stimulants or related molecules, if I'm not mistaken. And we see a huge expansion of the diagnosis of bipolarity, and we see a huge expansion of the diagnosis of ADHD. But we don't see that with schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is not a desirable diagnosis, it's not something sellable. In that, for me, in my mind, I see an intentionality. Do you see what I'm trying to say? We didn't see schizophrenia going from 2% to 10%, even though we know that up to 10% of the population has or have some sort of psychotic experiences. Like we have up to 7 to 10, depending on the paper, saying that people out there have delusions and they're just living their lives. They are hearing voices and they're just living their lives. But there is no expansion of that diagnosis. While bipolarity, we had like a guy like Joseph Bitterman who was, caught red-handed with $1 million in his account, not accounted for, and that kind of influence. And so I feel like really, there's really nobody behind this thing saying, okay, we're going to expand this diagnosis. Like Timimi, Dr. Timimi claims that their brands. For me, it's difficult not to see the intentionality, even though it's a net of things, of course, but we all get caught in this big, you see, I am sounding like a conspiracy theorist, right? Because we see this, like, okay, we add meds in this channel. We add, we see what happened to COVID when people started to question this whole thing, right? You see, I'm sounding like a conspiracy theorist. Any thoughts you guys have? I'll stop talking.
I would push back a little bit and say, using your example of schizophrenia, I see attempts, the attempt to include attenuated psychotic disorder in the DSM would lead to expansion. So I don't know if it's, I hear what you're saying, and I think that's a really good point, but I don't know if it's as clean as that. But I'm interested to hear what Milutin has to say.
I agree. I don't think anyone said there's no intentionality, in the sense that some people will make money off of more drug selling. That's capitalism. And there's absolutely intentionality in some circles around that. So this aspect is not questioned. What we were the main premise was the DSM panel in itself. How much power do they have? And they have some power, just it's not absolute. In regards to the diagnosis, you said, I think a lot of it has to do with culture. So we are obsessed with happiness. Then our focus, and my focus, is different than it was 20 years ago, because of all the social media, the quick videos, etc. So these are things that massively change in each of us. The age of loneliness, where we have massive loneliness, which makes people more anxious, more depressed. And the whole culture that wants to understand this putting science on a pedestal, where science knows everything, without understanding that psychiatry and behavior are humanistic sciences, where it's mostly probabilistic and not absolute answers where this is scientific. No, it's for you, it's one answer. For me, it's a different. But I think, like Lee said, it's a web. It's so many other things. So, for instance, some of I do think that some of the authors of papers that want to broaden some diagnostic criteria truly maybe are paid by pharma or have ghostwriters with the intentionality of making money. But I also think and know from my experience with drugs and this is also something when you have a hammer, everything is a nail, and when you are working in one field, then you see everything in it. And it's, and this is also, and this is, highly functioning depression, highly functioning ADHD, and then you want to see it in everything because this is all you do. And we, from day one, we are taught as in medical school to learn, what can I do to help? And what can I do to help? And there's never, what can I not do to make things worse? We just say, first do no harm. But it's just a word that just goes through the wind. And you never, for instance, Serbia at 6 years of medical school, you never once really get to work on the first do no harm as a concept detail. Everything is, what can I do to make things better? And this is a mindset in which there's never something you can do too much of. So this is, you have culture, people, you have social media that also is influenced by it. You have pharma that influences patient group, that influences media with media posts and etc. And you have them paying DSM penalties. So everything is happening at once. So it's just, in some cases, one is more prevalent in others, but absolutely there's some intentionality. It's not absolute.
Fair. And I would just add to that pharma couldn't have an influence on the DSM if the DSM didn't adopt a medical model. So it's the medicalization of distress that makes industry happy. And there was a real shift, as you know, and with your psychodynamic background, from DSM-2 to DSM-3. That's really when psychiatrists adopted the white coat, and that was at a time when psychiatry certainly was, lowest on the rung of medical specialties. And there was this great hope, I think, within psychiatry that now we'll be real doctors. We'll be seen like cardiologists, and the era of the brain. And in fact, Bob Spitzer, who was of course chair of the DSM-3, in an interview came out and said in 2011, "Oh, the pharmaceuticals were delighted with DSM-3." And I don't think he realized what he was giving away there. And he was right. But again, I don't think it was an intention on Bob Spitzer or anyone else's part. I think it was a guild interest,
Yeah.
never ask a barber if you need a haircut, a psychologist if you need therapy, and a psychiatrist if you need medication. I wouldn't trust a clinical practice guideline written by all psychologists, because they're just going to advocate for psychotherapy. So I think that the guild interest plays a critical role in addition to the pharmaceutical money.
And this goes back to your question, why don't psychiatrists don't understand? And one of the answers is they, as a guild, we have no interest to understand, because understanding it would mean losing money, losing control, losing authority. And this is all that comes from this scientific basis, which is linked inseparably with pharmaceuticals, which are like the biological influence on the body. Without it, we are again going back to the 60s and 50s with psychoanalysis, and from which psychiatry wanted to run away from. So it's both have use, both psychiatry from pharmaceuticals and pharmaceuticals from psychiatry, as formed now with the distress model of everything.
Makes sense. I see. Yeah, I struggle with that because, but I see your point. It makes complete sense. One frustration I have, for example, and we spoke briefly about it via email, was, so for example, now I'm reading, and I'm going to talk to the authors of a book called Psychopharmacology Reconsidered, Bellmaker in Lichtenberg. I'm going to talk to them next Sunday, probably release in a few months, if everything goes well. And they wrote this review, pretty much, this psychopharm book, that it's much more grounded, right? It's like it shows the shortcomings of what we do. But indeed, not like, for example, stalls, that was the topic of our conversation. And, it's hard not to see the book as a catalog. And in general, that was before I took the red pill. Before I woke up to all these things, I was just overwhelmed with the fact that for APA-endorsed books, every medication is good for everything. And literally, like, everything can be used for it. Like, if you take Schatzberg, for example, the feeling you have is that everything is good for everything. And I don't even never put Schatzberg names on open dialogue. But Stahls, as I thought it was on $8 million, he's a bounty from PHARMA, but it is apparently 11, so I'm short 3. But we see a small movement waking up. Now we have Maudsley deprescribing guidelines by Horowitz. I had the pleasure of meeting him last year in the podcast as well. So there is something happening. And I ask myself, and I don't know if you guys have any thoughts in that sense, if you fantasize with this problem as much as I do, how can we do this thing? How can we, within ourselves, promote the right ideas, and maybe the ideas that we need to reinvent our practice, minus the excesses, versus this well-coordinated system where we have personal interests, where we have a lot of fear. Because when when I started the podcast, I said, "Oh my God, people are just not aware of these things." Now people don't want to hear about it. It's different. It's anxiety provoking, right? And I have tried many ways. Even with my mentorship, I had this mentorship that I didn't realize, but people perceived it, even though they were paying for it, as very aggressive. And to the point that a student one day said, "Rod, you could tell us what to do, and that would help a lot, instead of telling us what's out of place." And I say, okay. And then I started to do that, and there was an impact, right? Trying to Answer the question, what would psychiatry look like if we were not blinded by those influences, right? Do you guys have any ideas, how to go about this thing? Do you think is a winnable battle at all?
I'm curious. I'd like to say something. I'm very curious to hear Milutin's thoughts on this. So I would say I'm guardedly optimistic. And what I mean by that is I see younger psychiatrists being more critical and more curious. I think the people who are hardest to reach were those who are around my age, maybe a little bit older, who came of age during that decade of the brain and during the time when biological psychiatry will reign supreme and we'll find, genes for this or for this disorder or that disorder. So I think those folks are the hardest to reach. And what I think is I have empathy for this because the analogy I always give is if a cardiologist finds out that they prescribed a medication that did more harm than good, they feel awful. They'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe, I wish I knew. I feel so bad, but they wouldn't have a identity crisis, right? They wouldn't think, oh my God, I'm leaving the field of cardiology. If psychiatrists, particularly of that generation, took seriously the notion that they possibly did more harm than good, that's a, pun intended, bitter pill to swallow. So I see the younger generation of psychiatrists being more curious and more willing to think critically.
Yeah. So first, I have to support you in the theories, what the conspiracy theories realm, because one of the reasons I am afraid that we are allowed to have now a pushback on some of the drugs, especially antidepressants. I am afraid if it's happening because it's supposed to open the door for the new wave of psychedelics, etc. So I think we should be very careful about that and not celebrate too early. But on the other hand, I do think something is happening, and the people who are leading it, like Mark Horowitz or like Lisa, aren't just there to push psychedelics. And I'm sure if psychedelics get into their into their place, that they will push back. But we've seen a lot of people since the 90s push back, but they were so marginalized. And you see that the media has the capability of marginalizing it. And like I said, you said at the beginning, there's so many studies showing you this. Why don't people, want to hear about the influence? Because yeah, it comes out, this one study, but then there's 20 studies about how the drug is awesome. And then it just gets lost in the noise. And this is what they do. So I would be careful about this. And Lisa has a wonderful book that I give to all my residents. And I agree that younger people are more open because they're new to the practice. And her book is Psychiatry Under the Influence. And I give them all. And like you, one day when she read it, she came to me and she was depressed. And she said, in the colloquial sense, not in the diagnostic sense. And she says, what's the point of all of this? So what am I supposed to do now with all this information when everything is, misused and our profession, etc. And we talked about it. And my opinion is that I am mostly I mostly think we must be political. I think this is not just a pharma problem. I think this is a capitalism problem. I think this is a political problem in which things that make short-term capital and money will always be pushed to the forefront because the system is built that way. This is not necessarily, like in a Disney movie, an evil guy who just wants to. No, I can make money. People see they can make money, and they'll do what they can to make money. And the system is just so you have to change the whole perception of because things that we could do don't make money. Things that could make people less lonely, things that could, influence a lot of the daily life, the meaninglessness of jobs that most people do that make them unhappy, anxious, lose focus. These things are for those who are leading the world, who have most of the capital. they're the winners and they find that's good. They don't want to change that. So the little people end up with, getting a diagnosis because they don't find that they are suffering in the world we're living in. So just changing the profession, I think, will never be enough, because even if we short-term change it, I think it'll all come back in such a system. So yeah, I'm very pessimistic that'll happen soon. To answer shortly the question.
And usually I avoid political topics here, because one thing about even with the critical psychiatry mailing group is that I learned so much from them. But there's always this thing about capitalism versus socialism or whatever, things like that. But we have in our field, despite the field being as it is and the information being out there, 76% of psychiatrists in America are Democrats. So it is really something you would expect, a cognitive dissonance, but it's not there. To your point, is because people are seeing themselves as doing something essentially good, without. But there is you have to kill. To do that, we did murder medicine, the philosophy of medicine, like first do no harm, and we did murder medicine as an art, because it became this automated thing, unfortunately. One thing I'd like to ask is, I don't know, I'm not updated on the last DSM review, but was adult onset ADHD included there?
No.
No, not yet. Do you guys have any prediction in that regard, considering, the market around this idea, like Medscape has this topics and things saying, adult onset ADHD, how to treat. It's like accepted as a thing at this moment, even though DSM, last time I checked on 5, but not the review, says, these symptoms this traits, symptoms, whatever we want to call it, need to be present between 7 and 12 years old.
Yeah, but
that change to 12, some folks have suggested that could account for, going from the 7-year mark to the 12 was led to, not the only reason, but led to the expansion of what we would call adult ADHD.
Yeah, and I think because when a person of 25, and this is my experience, so when a person of 25 comes to you and say, yeah, I remember now, when after all the social media posts, now I remember when I was in school, I had trouble listening, 15 years ago. I'm very skeptical if they truly remember, but it's easy to, push it in. And Lisa and I had the experience of people telling us about how easily also the attending psychiatrists would say, oh, this is a problem, even when the person doesn't think it was a problem in doing something. And like you said, when a person wants the diagnosis, then they'll go to the second, the third, the fourth, until they find the person who'll give them the diagnosis and the drug if they want it, etc. And this is also a very, very nice observation from a colleague from Lisa's lab, who said, now you have ADHD specialized psychiatrists, and then you look for them, and that they're there to, just by branding themselves this way, they're not going, oh, I'm not going to give you. They're there to give you the diagnosis, to let you hear what you want to hear. So I'm not sure they even need to make the change, because already the numbers are skyrocketing. You have lack of Adderall on the market because so much is bought. So it's I'm not sure. Shortage, yeah. I'm not sure that they necessarily need to add the very diagnosis this way.
That's a very good point. One thing that I frequently say, I don't know if this is I don't think this is an English expression. It's a Portuguese expression that I translate literally to English, which is usually weird. But we say that once the paste is out of the tube, the toothpaste, you can't put it back. And we had one of my previous episodes, every so often I do a monologue, was on Seroquel. And I found, I think, 3 meta-analyses of Seroquel, one for bipolar depression, the other one for PTSD, the other one for, I think was MDD as an adjunctive treatment. And all those three meta-analyses included only pharma-sponsored studies, right? And like some of them were done by employees of AstraZeneca, and then you get caught in these things, right? They get caught. Like last time I checked, AstraZeneca was in nearly $1 billion, 900 and something millions, which is compared to other drugs is pretty low still. Of lawsuits and settlements on account of false advertisement and deals with doctors and things like that. But now it's too late because we became a profession that reads titles and abstracts at tops, and the titles and abstracts that we see, or when we see a full text that is available from a journal that needs money to survive, you have to ask yourself who paid for that thing to be open access, right? Who's paying for this and who's not paying for everything else, right? So yeah, I see what you're saying. It's like once it's out, who cares, right? Now everybody's on Seroquel, like everybody. I never found, and I started to ask this question about 2 years ago to colleagues and mentees, would you take Seroquel? And the only time I found someone to say yes was a gentleman that wanted to tell me that he was actually part of the seminal studies of Seroquel. And he followed saying, I would not take high doses and I would never take chronically. I would really take it if I did, but it's because I was part of the very nice guy. But I never found one professional that would say, I'll take Seroquel for insomnia. And yet we continue to offer, and yet people continue to accept, which made me question, are we actually doing informed consents if we wouldn't take something that our patients are taking, right? And it sounds like we're minimizing that too, because, the idea is to push drugs. What else would I do without it? God forbid I have to do therapy. What else I'd like to ask you guys, because I waited a long time for this thing.
Can I just interject?
Please do it. I'm here to listen.
Now that you said about how informed consent, I had a lecture in Serbia where we talked about new findings, and it was focused on the umbrella review by Moncrief et al. About serotonin not being there.
Yeah.
And one thing that Lisa mentioned about the older generation, it was that some of the doctors really got mad. One especially got and said, "This is." But how could you blame him? For 30 years, he's been telling his patients, "You have a lack of serotonin," and some kid comes and says, "No, everything you said was wrong." But another professor who's very nice, and she says, "Yeah, so." Can you give us a suggestion now, since every one of us at some point probably told the patient you need this because your lack of his happiness hormone. So how can we tell our patients now to make them take the drug? And this is the mindset that really struck me. But you don't have to make them take the drug. You can just tell them what's the truth and let them, like you said, share decision making. But this is the form we need to make them. And I think it just went from psychosis, where in extreme cases of agitation, aggression, self-aggression, heteroaggression, there are extreme, very small number of cases where you maybe need to do something short-term to prevent the person doing harm to themselves or others. But then it's like just slip them to anything. And I don't think, for instance, depression, there's no loss of anything in relation to insight, etc. And every depressed patient can decide for themselves. And you should always, and like I said, I told her, I think we should always practice radical honesty. Yeah, we don't know how it works. It works in this number of patients, up to 15% short term. Long term, I would be afraid of using, and this is how I talk to my patients. But this is just the idea. Yeah, well, we have to tell them that something to get them to take the drug, because this is our job. And this is the mindset, like we said, we have to do something.
Have any of you faced any pushback on account of your positions and research, especially, I mean, Dr. Cosgrove, Lisa, the stuff you do is unbelievable. I really like your publications. Have you ever faced any pushback in that regard?
Oh, sure. I'm definitely not on the Christmas card list of the leadership in APA. um, yeah, what frustrates me and saddens me the most is being positioned as anti-psychiatry. I always try to go to great pains to emphasize I'm not anti-psychiatry. I'm pro-informed consent. Um, so that's been the sort of pushback that I've gotten. But you have to have a thick skin to do this kind of research because first of all, you just don't get funded. I'd have to
Yes.
have a hell of a bake sale to really fund my lab. Um, so we do what we do because we find it interesting, and hopefully we're doing a small service. And so that sort of pushback and marginalization, I'm not. I'm old enough to not be surprised, and I'm old enough to not care so much.
Oh, good for you, man. I suffer with solitude in this thing. Every time I get an interview, I feel so excited because, it's someone to talk about it. Because all the time when you're sharing these ideas, people do look at you as if you have lost your mind. I'm in a very comfortable position. I'm a director in a place where in my employers, they are very open-minded. One of them was a social worker. He saw the impact that patients diagnosed with schizophrenia had being treated by the adaptations of open dialogue in Vermont and New Hampshire. He saw it. So when I interviewed for the job, I went like full blown insane. I said, I vomited everything I could. And he said, oh, we want this guy. And I was like, oof, I wasn't counting on it. It turns out that I have their ear to make changes. And one of them, of course, the first problem to address is polypharmacy. After that, we can actually talk about, all right, let's look into psychotherapy a little bit. Let's look into PRN use of medications. Let's review our philosophy. Instead of suppressing symptoms, let's foster movement. Let's see, and people do think I'm an anti-psychiatrist. I say, no, I like drugs. I like them. I like nicotine. I like alcohol. I like them so much that I use them PRN so they don't lose their effect. And that's my joke, but it's also true. Like if I were to try to live daily with the impact that a little bit of alcohol and nicotine has on my brain, it will be unsustainable. And we know those things. We know the brain is going to make an effort to bypass whatever we throw at it. And that part we know. But when you question, people say, well, but down the road, and there's this cascade of events. And then people embrace what we don't know and prefer to believe that because most likely it generates a lot of anxiety, because, okay, now I have to relearn all this thing. And I say, yes, you do, because I'm hiring now. And I say, that's the task at hand, relearn psychiatry in a sustainable way so we can save this damn thing from the growing unpopularity that the profession is getting into. And how about you, Milutin? Did you face any pushbacks on your?
Well, I was shocked but not shocked. I understood it when I just recently published a study on watchful waiting in depression. But when I was presenting this study to my colleagues, you have to get the approval to do the study at the institute by a group of heads of wards, and they got me to return twice to change some things because etc. But at one point, one of the main psychiatrists in the hospital almost agitated said, well, we cannot not give them anything. He was like, what are you doing? What's so this is the mindset. He was shocked that I was suggesting we might not give a drug to patients. So I've heard some people who I'm good with told me that, like you, that they call me an anti-psychiatrist, but mostly behind my back. I haven't heard anyone tell it to my face. And I work a lot with young residents, and now some of them are already becoming psychiatrists. And it's getting less lonely because I started working with these topics with them from the start, so they are not relearning. They got into this, like I said, the minute they come into our hospital, they get Lisa's book, and this is the start. And I've had pushback from some professors who said they first need to learn proper psychiatry and then they can critically evaluate it. And I said, no, they have to first understand critics and then in parallel with this and make their own mind. I don't care if they think I'm nuts, that's okay. But most that I've worked with, I think I'm getting good feedback, and I'm now already at the point where I'm learning a lot from them as well. It's not just that I'm the teacher, now I'm becoming the student from them, because a lot of them are brilliant. So it's getting much less lonely, but at one point it was very lonely.
Yeah, I can relate to that. So guys, thank you for accepting this invitation. I had a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed as much as I did.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would love to keep in touch. Okay?
Yeah.
I liked it very much. I think I needed the balance you guys brought, because at times I come to these interviews with all my degree of frustration with the field. But that, at the end of the day, was one of my motivations for the podcast, so I could actually have a lot of blood in my eyes here and kind of pretend to be civilized out there. But it was interesting that I started with blood and you guys said, well, calm down. It's not like they're a cabal. They're just trying, they're really, and I said, okay, that helps me a lot, actually. So I really enjoyed it. I really liked it. I get pretty relentless. And I said, I'll leave this woman alone. And I said that last year. And then as I'm living my life, I found another paper of yours. I say, hell no, I'm attacking again. So, it's because it's your work is unspeakably important. So I really appreciate what you do. I really do.
That means very much to me. I respect your work enormously, and that means a lot. And I've told Milutin.
And like I do prescribe meds at times, but it's like as needed and with this rationale. I'm trying to foster movement. If you're stuck on something, you can use that drug. But here's the analogy, if you guys don't mind. A guy falls in love, and he cannot tell this girl that he fell in love, and now he's miserable, right? Because when you fall in love, misery or bliss, either or, but he's miserable because he doesn't have the girl. And he decides to drink every day to placate his suffering. And he does, and he works initially. In 6 months, he's just a drunkard. Alternatively, the same guy doesn't have what it takes to talk to the girl, but he has a friend that gives him a shot of liquid courage, booze as well, and say, drink this thing and tell this girl you love her. Now, it's the same freaking drug. One is fostering movement, the other one is fostering stagnation, which is the main criticism to what we prescribe, that we're suppressing the very pain that should get you in movement, which is it's the evolutionary view of pain, and it kind of goes along with Moncrief spoke about the drug-centered model, which is also an alternative way to look at meds. It makes much more sense.
That's a very interesting analogy you made.
Yeah,
I haven't thought of it this way.
I've been exploring this thing because what we lack in the field now is philosophy, right? What is that we want? One of my episodes was, and I had the help of Paul and Andy Thompson, was what's the purpose of psychiatry? And then you say, well, we are causing desirable impairments. People are functioning exactly as they're supposed to in those circumstances. So, but some impairments are desirable. I want to be faced on a Saturday night, right? But what we do in psychiatry nowadays is to foster stagnation, right? We give you enough drugs so you sit in front of Netflix, and your ambitions, the fire you used to have. And no one can say that I'm right, and no one can say that I'm wrong, because we haven't sat as a profession and said, okay, what matters in life? What's the philosophical tenets of what we do? Those questions were never asked.